Hey guys, hope that you're ready for class tonight. We're going to give it a few minutes as we wait for everybody to come into the classroom. I'm going to go ahead and switch screens for a second here and set up the chat here. It has been a beautiful few days, especially compared to what we have had. Again, just give me a second here while I set this up. Stuff used to just work automatically, and for some reason I have to set it up every time now. There we go. All right. Go back to the main screen here for a minute. I know that we're going to have a few out from our number, at least in the live class tonight. And of course, anytime that you have to miss class, you can always go back to the feed and rewatch it. Anytime you want to go back and review it, that would also be a good idea. I do want to take the moment to remind you of your classwork. If you're a level 2 student in the classroom, make sure that you pay attention to that. There are 2 videos in the classroom this week. They are from a series called Following the Messiah. It's by Appian Media. I'm pretty sure that they are members of the church. They are about some of the locations. They go on site to some of the locations around Jesus' ministry and so forth. So I think that would be really interesting. The whole series is about 10 lessons or 10 videos, and I haven't viewed them all, but it'd probably be good if you want to view them. Go right ahead. But I did put link up to that I thought were especially important. We're going to get ready to get into our material actually tonight, and again, I've just been trying to give everybody a minute to join us here, and we might be a little bit short tonight. I know Jennifer and Adam both are not going to be able to join us. If you are a level 2 student, this is week 6. This is so we're up for our first test. That test will go live next Tuesday. And you will have basically a week to do that test in. Now, it doesn't mean you can do the test over a week, but you can pick a day in that week and do the test. It will be open book, open Bible, open notes. You can go back into the classroom, review PowerPoints, video lessons, things like that if you need to during the test. Though I do encourage you to do that leading up to the test, to be prepared for it. Let's see, one more. And this is on the honor code because I can't see you. I don't know what you all are doing on your own, but open book, open Bible, open notes, anything from the classroom. But I'm asking you not to ask someone else for the answers. It needs to be your work. So on the test, you can use a Bible, you can use the notes, you can open the classroom, you can go back and view these videos if you need to, but just you need to be answering them, not someone else. I think that would be obvious, but I'll go ahead and say it. I don't know if anybody else joined us, but we're getting ready to go. We've been talking about the New Testament, trying to do a survey of the whole New Testament in 12 lessons. So we're really kind of hitting this, fast. We don't have the time in this layout to study these things in detail, and there is a reason that I want to do this in such a broad way so quickly. Is that way we see the broad picture, we see the forest. And then in future courses, we come back in and we focus on the trees. So the very next course after this one that will be offered in the fall will be on the life of Christ. Last week and this week we're talking about the life of Christ, but just 2 lessons over the whole life of Christ. We're just skimming the surface. But that particular course will spend 12 lessons on the life of Christ. And again, we could spend 100 lessons on the life of Christ. Still not exhaust it all, but the whole idea is to help you to study deeper, to know this material, and then along the way also be able to teach others about Christ, about the church, about Christian thought, and so on and so forth. I'm hoping I'm coming through good tonight. If someone wants to let me know that in the chat, that also give me an idea on how much of a delay we are on tonight. And then we will get started. Awesome. All right. Tonight, again, we're talking about the ministry of Jesus, and then we're going to talk about the death of Jesus. Obviously, there's a lot to be said here, but, there's, again, we're just kind of surveying. So we talked about the birth of Jesus. We talked about his baptism a little bit. We talked about the trials in the wilderness a little bit last week. This week, we're just going to kind of skim over what he was doing in his ministry. And then the last part, we're going to really spend some time talking about his death, which is so fundamental and pivotal to this whole Christian way of life, and this whole Christian way of thought and teaching is based on his death and then, of course, his burial and resurrection. Well, let's just talk generally about Jesus' ministry for a minute. The ministry of Jesus begins at the baptism of John, when John baptizes Jesus, and continues through his death on the cross. And we talked about some things related to the baptism of John and Jesus. We're not going to go back into that, but that stands as our starting point for his public ministry. Now, he talked to people, obviously, before that. We have some record of that when he was 12, but he didn't start this ministry of preaching of the kingdom and so forth until about this time, somewhere around 30 years old, and this baptism of John. John had been preparing the way beforehand. He spends about 3 years in this earthly ministry before he dies on the cross. It's a very, very short window. And sometimes we can just, we just seems like we have so much time that we kind of lose track of just how valuable time is, as well as how much we can do in a short given period or window of time. Jesus did all this in 3 years. Now, I know he's Jesus, and we're not, but the point is that 3 years is all he's going to do as far as this earthly ministry before he turns it over to the apostles, the beginning of the church, and it goes forward through its march in time. His ministry consisted of many, many things, but I just want to break them down into 3 main areas, and you could break this down other ways too, but one is fulfillment of prophecy, the second is the miraculous deeds he did, and the third is his actual teaching. Now, again, we're just talking about these things. We're not going to have time tonight to look at these things in depth. Again, we will do this in our Life of Christ course, and I really hope that you sign up for that. We'll be offering it in the fall. But when we talk about Jesus coming on the scene, there's this whole picture of prophecies related to Jesus, where he was going to be born. The things surrounding his birth, the virgin birth, for instance, his location of his birth, what he'd be called, his name, things related to his ministry, that he'd be able to heal the blind and the deaf, the things related to his death, that he would die as a sheep before his shears is silent, that he'd be put before, that he would die amongst criminals, which he does. There's a thief on both sides, and yet buried with the rich. He's buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So there's all kinds of, there's prophecies about how he's going to be treated on the cross, about them gambling for his clothes, about them plucking his beard from his face, prophecy about no bones being broken. He dies before they come around and break the legs on the cross. We might have a chance to touch on that. The point is that there's all these prophecies related to Jesus from the Old Testament, hundreds of years old, some of them 700 years old or more, and they all are fulfilled in Jesus. Not most of them, not 90% of them, not 80%, but every one that was spoken is fulfilled in Jesus. And again, we'll cover that in great detail in that next course, but just kind of laying the foundation here, Jesus' ministry had to show forth the fulfillment of all that prophecy. The second was the miraculous deeds. And, Jesus did, obviously, miracles. He did miracles of healing. He did miracles that weren't related to healing, like walking on the water. He walked out of the midst of people wanting to stone him without them being able to touch him. He was able to turn water into wine. He showed forth his ability to have authority over everything: death, life, health, plants, the water, calming the storm. He just spoke to and smote the fig tree and it died. I mean, all these different things that happen in his life, and all of it's to teach us that he is who he claimed to be. It's the foundation, it's the evidence of his claims. And then, of course, the third, which is ultimately the most important. It's not the most glamorous. I mean, the deeds obviously are. The most exciting, maybe talking about prophecy. We always like to prophecy. But his teaching is the most important because it's how we learn. It's how we become in his likeness. And it's how we ultimately go before the Father and into a heavenly place. But it's how we live here in this life to its intended purpose and its intended benefit. So those are kind of three main areas of his ministry. His ministry was limited. He only stayed in Judah and in the surrounding areas, Galilee. He does go into Samaria for a little piece, but not much. He doesn't travel to Europe. He doesn't go down to Africa. He doesn't go to Asia. He stays pretty tight to that area, and for a reason. He was supposed to go and speak to the Jews, and that's what he did. The apostles then would spread out that message onto the outer parts of the world, including into us and beyond us and so forth. Jesus used many parables to teach truth and to reveal God's will. The parable of the sower, the parable of the wheat and tares, the parables of the great pearl, the pearl of great price, the hidden treasure, parable of the vineyard. All these parables were used, and the idea of a parable is to lay beside. So I'm just going to use one as an example tonight, and then and we're going to reference this. We're not going to have time to read the whole thing. It's kind of long. But in the book of Luke chapter 15, and of course you are free to go back and read this. I would encourage it. There are actually three parables in that passage. The first one is a shepherd who has 100 sheep. One goes missing. He leaves the 99 to find the one. When he finds the one and brings it back, how he rejoices over that which was lost and now is found. Then it goes down, and more important, I guess. So there's a woman who has 10 coins of some considerable value. She loses one. So we had 1/100th before. Now it's 1 out of 10. And she sweeps the house until she finds it. When she finds it, she invites her friends over, and they celebrate because she has found something that was lost of value, and she's found it again. And it says, and the hosts of heaven rejoice. Of course, that's the spiritual message behind it. Then the last one is one that we know in that kind of trio of parables, the parable of the prodigal son. This man, as Jesus said, has 2 sons. The youngest son says, I don't want to wait till you die. Give me my inheritance now. He actually does that. He goes off. He lives this decrepit life. He lives this life out in the Gentile world until he loses everything he's got. He's face to face with some swine, some pigs, says it's going to be better as be a servant at my father's house. Goes back, and of course, if we know the story, his father runs to meet him. Puts a ring on his finger, puts a robe on his back, puts new sandals on his feet, kills the fatted calf, celebrates because his son was dead and now alive. In other words, he was lost, he thought he was dead, and now he's alive. And of course, there's a second part of that. The older brother then is upset because he gives so much attention to his younger brother, and that's actually a little bit of a picture that's important, but the point is that he uses these parables, stories that people could get and understand. The mustard seed. They understood what a mustard plant looked like. They understood what happened when you sowed seed on the wayside versus good soil. They understood. That's why he was able to use these parables to lay beside a spiritual truth. It's one of his main ways of teaching in his ministry. The other one is just a direct use of sermons, as we might consider them. And the most important one and the most popular one is Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. He gives this tremendous treatise on the character and actions of a child of God. With our thoughts, with our goals, with our actions, with how we think, what we do. I mean, really, he just covers so much ground in that short bit of time, that one sermon. But it gives us a little bit of an idea, well, not more than a little bit. It gives us the framework of which God wants us to be, you and me, as a child of God. So we talk about his ministry, and again, we're talking about in general ways here. We don't have time to go into so many different specifics, which, again, we'll do in another course. Again, I encourage you to study for yourself. But we'll see that, especially early on, people were really happy to hear. There's a prophet back in the land, John. Now the Messiah has come. He's going around. He's doing these miraculous things. People are being healed. Crowds are gathering to him. Except when he starts to challenge them and give them something more difficult, starts to talk about spiritual truths, those crowds disperse, and he's left often with just a handful. An example would be in John chapter 6, when Jesus is being followed by this huge crowd, 5,000 men. He looks to his apostles and said, they've been following us all day. They're going to be weary. They need to eat. And they say, there's no way we can feed them. We don't have enough money. Even if we did have enough money, there wouldn't be enough to buy. That's when Andrew finds the little boy with the lunch, a couple of small loaves, a couple of small fish. He sits everybody down. He breaks. He gives blessing. He breaks it. They pass it around till everybody has enough to eat. And then he passes around 12 baskets, for each doubting apostle. And they go around and pick up the scraps, and each basket is full. After that, those people in that crowd thought, oh man, this is the prophet that was spoken of. If he can multiply fish and bread, well, surely he can multiply soldiers and armaments, and we can free ourselves from Rome. And Jesus wasn't here to do that. So he started talking about spiritual things. I'm the man who's come down from heaven. Again, this is the latter part of John chapter 6. And then they scratch their head and say, isn't this Jesus whom father and mother we know? In other words, who is this guy think he is? And they eventually leave him. So Jesus was, despite the miracles, despite the tremendous teaching, he was willing to tell people what they needed to hear, but people weren't always willing to listen to what they needed to hear. Kind of sum this up by turning to the book of John in chapter 20. There's 21 chapters in the book of John. Chapter 20, the latter part, last two verses, 30 and 31. And John writes this, and truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. As a matter of fact, if you go to the next chapter, chapter 31, John would make another comment that the world can hold the volume if they wrote everything that Jesus did down. So you have this tremendous testimony by John saying, we wrote these things as you read through Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, so that you could have confidence in who Jesus is and then have life there in his name. In other words, in his authority, in his teaching. All right, so when we talk about the ministry of Jesus, again, some of the main highlights, and these are important, is kind of the way he taught, through these parables, through sermons, but he taught where people could get a hold of it if they wanted to. That's key. He did say some hard things, but usually it was more about acceptance and willing to accept what he's saying rather than difficulty to understand. He backed it up with miracles and signs. Jesus had some specific ones that were said to be attached to the Messiah, which he did, which was healing the deaf and healing the blind. He raised the dead. He healed lepers. He healed a whole town on one occasion. That happened to include Peter, the Apostle Peter's mother-in-law. He did all these miraculous things, not just to make people's lives better. I mean, it did in the short term, but he did it to confirm who he was. That's very important for us to understand. And that's what John says here, so that you and I can know and have confidence in who he was and what he was teaching. Again, we're covering a lot of ground here in just one big swipe of the life of Jesus. But we're jumping now to the last week of Jesus' life, and I'm just going to outline this in a way that Richard Rogers, which was a teacher at Sunset years ago, did, because I find it, and he probably got it from someone else too, but I find it a good way to understand this. The last week, or what's sometimes called the Passion of Christ. When you hear that, like there's a movie called The Passion of Christ, they're talking about the last week of his life. I don't know where that started as far as the passion part of it, but that's what it's become known as. It starts on a Sunday, and that day is a day of glory. That's when he rides into town on the donkey, and they put down their coats and their palm fronds, and they sing as he goes into town, Hosanna, Hosanna, basically, our King, our King. Okay. It's a day of glory. He goes into the city of Jerusalem in glorious tribute. And then Monday comes, and it's a day of power. We see him cleanse the temple. This is the second time he does it. We see him curse a fig tree that's going to die. We see him as the man, well, as the Son of God in his power, that he has authority, that he has power, that he has strength. That's kind of the emphasis on Monday. Then on Tuesday, controversy takes hold, and this is when the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, the leaders, that's what I mean by those groups, they're different groups, but they're the leaders, start to plot again to arrest Jesus, and the Passover's coming up, so they have to move quickly. So we see that happen. There is nothing in Scripture that we know of recorded on that Wednesday before his death. So it's a day of silence. Richard Rogers, which I think is a good, that's why I'm going to share it with you, believes that it was probably a day of rest for Jesus, that he just took it as a day of rest and silence and to himself. I think that's as good a reason as any. I don't know if it's true or not, but we do know nothing particular is recorded for that day. Thursday. This is when Jesus tells his disciples to go prepare the upper room. This is where he spends that time getting ready in fellowship. He's going to really emphasize things with his apostles in that tight group, okay? And then, of course, Friday. Friday is when the trial happens. Well, Thursday into Friday is when the trial happens. He goes before the Jews first. They mock him. They hit him. They send him to Pontius Pilate, which we're going to look at here in a minute. He tries them. He doesn't find anything wrong with them. He sends them up to Herod. He doesn't find anything wrong with him. He tries to get out of it by scourging them and hoping that was enough for him. They didn't like it. The soldiers take him, mock him. The Jews and leaders still aren't happy. He brings out this man named Barabbas, which was a known, well, you know, kind of an ancient mobster. I mean, he was a bad guy, a bad dude. And he said, well, we have a tradition to let one of your men go at this time of year. And they said, no, let Barabbas go. We want Jesus crucified. And Jesus will eventually go to the cross, and he will die on that Friday. Saturday is a day of gloom. Jesus is dead. He's in the tomb. His disciples are scared. They're frightened. They're behind a closed door. I'm sure that Satan, I'm sure that the Jewish leaders who were against Jesus thought it was a day of victory, but it was a day of deep gloom. And then, of course, that Sunday after that is that day of triumph. I like to break it down this way, and when we study the life of Christ, we're going to talk about this in much more detail, all the events that happened on these days. But for now, I think it's good to just get a little bit of a feel of what happened and how it happened. So you have this ministry, very short, 3 years. Starts with the baptism of John, goes directly into that wilderness temptation scenario, and then Jesus going out preaching and teaching until this last week in which these events happened, and eventually his death on the cross. All right, so the last part of this class, and I'm going to take a pause here, and if you have thoughts or questions that you want to put into the chat, go ahead and do so. I'm just going to kind of lay this out. We're going to jump over to the book of Matthew in chapter 27 here and talk about the death of Jesus. And again, there's going to be a lot more we could say, but we want to hit some of the highlights and understand just what he went through because it's so central to everything we're going to talk about in the New Testament. It is the blood that buys or pays for the covenant that we are in. Okay. You know, sometimes we just need to hear things put together in a little bit different way. It helps us see them a little bit different. I really think, let me back up. When we do the life of Christ, like when I went through Sunset, did the life of Christ, it was 24 weeks, which is great. I mean, get a lot more time to spend and study on the life of Christ. It could have been 48 weeks, and we could have gotten a lot of detail. But sometimes you lose the momentum of seeing it in a bigger picture. When we do the life of Christ, we're only going to be doing 12 weeks. So hopefully that same feel will remain there, so you can kind of see how it unfolds. And I really think that's a good way, not the only way, but it is a good way to study some of these things, and then go back and study in detail, and then go back and do a broader view. Appreciate the comment, Shayna. All right, let's go ahead and turn over to Matthew chapter 27. All right, let me do this differently because I'm going to lose my chat on this screen. So I'm going to jump back here for a second. Sorry, that'll work. All right. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 27. I happen to have the ESV up. Normally I do a lot of stuff in New King James Version. I do really like the ESV, but that's the version if you're curious of which version I'm using here tonight. Chapter 27, this is after the Jews already had their go at Jesus. They arrested him in the garden. They mocked him. They tried to bear false witness, but they wouldn't hold up. And then they take him to Pontius Pilate. In the very first verse it says, "When the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor." So, you know, this is their plan. We can't take his life. We're going to go and take him over to the governor. We're not going to read this, but this is where Judas, who had taken money to turn him in, goes back to the council and throws it at their feet, and because he feels bad, he feels guilty, so that they, you know, they don't have any sympathy for him, and eventually he's going to take his own life. So we're going to drop down here to verse 11. They've taken him to Pilate, who's the governor, the Roman governor, so he's head over that area as far as Rome is concerned. That is more powerful than the king, okay? When we hear King Herod, he's just a vassal king to Rome. The man who's in charge here is Pontius Pilate. It says in verse 11, "Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus said, 'You have said so.' But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer." That's part of the prophecy from Isaiah 53, that before his accusers he would remain silent. But then it goes on to say, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so the governor was greatly amazed. I mean, obviously, anybody who was brought before governor with people wanting his death, they'd be giving their side of the story, yet he remains silent. So this is that part that I mentioned a minute ago. He is not going to want to take Jesus' life because he can't find anything wrong with him. So he's going to send out this Barabbas figure, thinking that that will kind of placate them and put them back in perspective maybe. It doesn't work. It says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted, and they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ? For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Even Pontius Pilate knew this man was innocent, and that was a bunch of jealousy and envy why he was standing before him. In verse 19 it says, besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him. Now this is Pontius Pilate's wife. Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. So she has this dream, and then she comes and warns Pontius Pilate, no, don't do anything to this man. He is righteous. So Pontius Pilate is not going to find anything wrong with him. His wife is going to tell him that not to do this. Herod, when he sends them to him, is not going to find anything wrong with him. He knows their motives are terrible, but he's eventually going to do it anyway. So down to verse 21, they cry out for Barabbas to be released. In verse 22, Pilate says, then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? And they all said, let him be crucified. And he answered, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. All right, so he's going to try to placate them one more time by when he releases Barabbas, he has Jesus scourged. We talked about that Sunday morning a little bit. Roman scourging, most people didn't live through it. It's a pretty nasty and horrific ordeal, but he didn't die there. They ripped up his back with these sharp pieces of on these kind of nine tails as they whip and rip. But they still want Barabbas to go. They're still not happy. The soldiers take him down into the battalion. The whole battalion's there, and they strip him of his robe, his clothes. They put this crown of thorns on his head. They take off one of their legionnaire robes, you know, kind of the red robe if you think of a Roman soldier that you might see in a movie. And now his back's all ripped open wounds from that scourging, and they put it upon him, and then eventually they rip it off, reopening all those wounds. What he goes through here is just horrific. The whole time they're mocking him. The whole time they're, spitting on him and, mocking him as being a king. And that leads them to the crucifixion. And it is not a pleasant thought to think about everything Jesus went through, everything he did, the innocence that he had. And this is what God said had to be done. And if we take anything away from looking at the death of Jesus, it's not just that he died for sin, which he did. It should be to understand just how desperate and lost we were in our sins. That this was the only thing that God deemed worthy to cover our sins. Was not just a death, but this horrific death that Jesus had to endure so that we could be forgiven. So I hope we never count that as something common or something just that we pass by so quickly. Again, we're not going to have time to read all this. I'm going to kind of paraphrase part of this. But he's going to go out to... and of course, if you read the book of John and Luke and Mark, you're going to get some other details that aren't recorded here. But he's going to have to take this cross member of this cross that and carry it, but he can only carry it so far. So they ask a man named Simon of Cyrene, and he has to carry it the rest of the way. And they get him up on the hillside, and of course they're going to nail him to that cross. And then they have just a hole there, and they kind of lift him up, or whoever's being crucified, and just drop it down in the hole. And of course, again, just the pain that would be endured. And they mock him some more. I want to pick up on the mocking here, and then we're going to go to the actual death of Jesus. In verse 37, it says this, and over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe him." He did all those miracles. They didn't believe him. If he came down off that cross right then and there, they wouldn't believe him. They just were mocking him. They would come up with some other reason not to believe him. Verse 43 says, he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. The robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. Now, some of the other contexts, we get the story with the second thief, where he kind of comes around and actually sees that Jesus is innocent. But it's not recorded here. You'll have to go to one of the other contexts to get that. But verse 45 says, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. That's during the day. That is not at night. But it becomes just black, dark. And in the 9th hour, that's when Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And we have this translation, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the moment, this is the time when the Father has to turn his back on Jesus so that Jesus can be the sacrifice for our sins. And this is when he gives up his spirit. Now, when he dies, then all of a sudden people think that he's somebody special. It's really, really almost crazy. In the midst of all this, maybe their anger, maybe their zealousness blinded them. But as soon as he dies, in verse 49 it says, up here in verse 47 it says, some of the bystanders hearing it said, this man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine, think vinegar, and put it on a reed and gave it to him and drink. But the others said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. As soon as Jesus dies, there's this earthquake. The rocks literally split open. It's already dark. The temple, over the temple, they had these big curtains that separate the rooms. They ran in half down the center. And the tombs, it says, look at this, verse 52. The tombs, I don't know if you can see that right there, were opened. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And when Jesus came up from the grave, he wasn't the only one. It doesn't say how many, but he says the tombs. All of them, some of them, doesn't matter. It's pretty dramatic to me. They show up at their families' houses. And I don't know what happens to them afterwards. It doesn't say. But they appeared to many. They were there. The centurion who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake, what took place. They were filled with awe, it says. Truly this was the Son of God. And then, of course, we get into his burial and eventually his resurrection. There is so much here. But this is the moment in time where God said, this is my plan. This is my sacrifice. This is going to be my declaration of, my power and my victory in his resurrection, which we will talk about as we start our next class in Lesson 7. Yeah, I don't know on that. It would be interesting if someone did. But, today we are so accustomed to recording things. We record with our phones. We record because we've had reporters and so forth for so long. Only so many people could write in those days. Paper was really expensive. And the people who had the means to record these things weren't exactly Jesus fans. the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the chance of someone who was there in Jerusalem recording it makes it a little bit difficult. But yeah, it would be interesting if we could find that. And here's something on that. We've been doing archaeology quite a bit in one of the classes, or the two classes I've been teaching at FCA, talking about some of these things. And one of the points that was made by an archaeologist who's currently digging in Israel, only 5% of the ground, the biblical area, if you would, has been excavated. That means 95% of the places and the area and so forth that have these events take place has not been excavated. So we're still likely to find something like that, but so far I'm not sure. I think I would have come across that if there was something out there along those lines. All right, so let's recap a little bit. Make sure we get this on the life and the ministry of Jesus. And then we'll kind of open up. And while I'm doing this, if you have questions or thoughts, please, once again, put those in the chat. Jesus was born to a relatively poor family. Okay, there was really poor, and then the elite. There wasn't really a middle class in that society. Working family. He was born to a man named Joseph, a woman named Mary, who, as far as society considered, weren't anybody. He was born by chance, but it wasn't by chance, was it? In Bethlehem, because a census was given that forced them to go back because they were living in Nazareth to Bethlehem, and he just happens to be born there, but he had to be born there to fulfill the prophecies. You had all that accompanied that. The shepherds in the field with the heavenly host, the wise men that came. Herod then makes a decree to try to kill off these children. We see Jesus at 12 years old at the temple saying, I got to be about my Father's business. Previous to that, I skipped over this, I didn't mean to, but you had Anna and Simeon in the temple giving credence to who he was. And then you get him on the scene at 30 years old, being baptized by John, the wilderness temptations, right into the belly of the beast, if you would, right against Satan, and then right into this ministry, which was big. It was right there in the open. It wasn't hidden. It was in major cities, major towns, right in front of people. It wasn't back rooms, back corners, right there in the public. Huge crowds at times. The leaders involved, they don't, at least the leaders, just do not accept him. They want to kill him themselves. They can't. This little side note, in the Jewish law, if someone was a blasphemer, someone was guilty of something that required capital punishment, death, it was by stoning. The prophecies were that he would hang on a tree, which was also a disgrace in the Jewish culture. During the period of Jesus' ministry, right close, we don't know exactly, but pretty close. They had tried to stone him a couple times and couldn't do it. And then all of a sudden, they wanted to stone him, but weren't allowed to. They had been their right to carry out capital punishment had been removed by the Romans. So that's why they had to go to Pontius Pilate. If they were able to do it themselves, they would have stoned him. But he wasn't supposed to be stoned. He had to be crucified. And then sometime directly after Jesus' death, Rome had given back, Pontius Pilate had given back the rule to allow them to, in their own community, carry out capital punishment. And that's when you see early in the church, Stephen, for instance, being stoned. So that little window, by the providence of God, the Jews weren't allowed to carry out punishment, which ended up fulfilling prophecy. So there's so many things here that just really, really spectacular. But Jesus went to the cross. He endured all of that as a declaration of God of what sin really is, of a declaration of God of his plan and purpose for us, of how much he loves us, and how much he is willing to do to redeem us. And that's the biggest picture that we can get. Everything else stems from that as we go forward. All right, guys, we're going to kind of bring our class to a close tonight on that note. Again, there's so much more we could say, and we will say in that next course. But we are going to continue on and talk about Acts next week. Their test will go live next week. So be studying, be looking back through these first 6 lessons, the content. That's where the test will come from, is the content. Scriptures that are related to, that we've talked about, will be included. But that's where the lessons will come from. It's open notes. You can use the classroom material, the PowerPoints, open Bible. So it shouldn't be that bad, but I do encourage you to at least review some of this material before that test goes live. Any questions, any thoughts, anything you want to add, feel free to do so in the chat. And I'll give that a few minutes in case someone is writing, and then we will dismiss class. I just put out there to those who are in the class, I appreciate your all's attention and being a part of this. I hope that's been beneficial to you. I was telling Tiffany today, sometimes these lessons are a little bit harder for me. I'm so used to getting to specific details to go back and do kind of a cursory view or a survey view. Sometimes I wonder if I'm, hitting the right mark there. But all right, guys. All right. Good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and dismiss class. I will leave this open just a few more minutes in case there's any final thoughts that someone's still working on or questions. But otherwise, class is officially over. Hope to see most of you all tomorrow at church, Wednesday. And if someone happens to be viewing from a Facebook lead, you can always come join us tomorrow at Three Forks, 7 o'clock for our midweek Bible study. All right, guys. Well, you tell Miss Adeline, if you're listening, just time. We just keep studying. You just keep learning yourself, and you'll know more than me one day. Promise you. All right, guys. We will see you guys next time. Y'all have a good night.